It is the autumn of 1883, and a man named Elias Ward stands at the mouth of a canyon that most people have spent the last 20 years trying to avoid. He is a survey photographer hired to document the country the new railroad has opened, and he has come here to record the burned walls of an old stagecoach station near the base of Steins Peak. He sets his camera on its wooden tripod, he measures the light, and then, according to the notes he leaves behind, he does something he cannot quite explain. He writes down a sound. There is a wind moving through the rocks above him, threading between the high stone shoulders of the pass, and it does not sound like wind. It rises and falls in a way that seems almost deliberate, almost spoken. Ward asks a local man traveling with him what it is, and the man tells him, quietly, that the canyon has always made that sound, that the people who lived here long before the stagecoaches said the land remembers what passes through it. Ward writes it down. He does not explain it, and more than a century later we are left with a record that should not really exist. A photographer sent to document stone, who instead documented something he could not see. What was he listening to? Why would a canyon feared as a place of death be remembered by others as a place that speaks? Can a landscape hold memory? Or were some people simply listening in a way the rest had forgotten how to do? And when the first cameras finally came to this pass, what did they actually capture? This is the story of Doubtful Canyon, and it is the story of two ways of knowing the same piece of ground. To the travelers who crossed the American Southwest in the 1860s, this narrow gap in the Peloncillo Mountains carried a name that was also a warning. They called it Doubtful Canyon, because when you entered it, your survival was in doubt. The land changed hands more than once in a single generation. Spain claimed it, then Mexico. Then, in 1854, it became part of the United States through the Gadsden Purchase. But the people who already lived here had agreed to none of that. The Chiricahua Apache, whose homeland stretched across what is now southern Arizona, southwestern New Mexico, and northern Mexico, had moved through these mountains for generations, and to them this pass was not a doubtful place at all. It was known. Every spring, every narrow path, every high ridge already had a name and a purpose. That is the collision at the heart of this story. To the outsider, Doubtful Canyon was an empty and hostile void to be survived. To the Chiricahua, it was a landscape that had been read for generations, the way another people might read a written page. What outsiders expected to find here was nothing. What they actually moved through was a place already mapped in memory. Consider what that kind of knowing actually meant. The Chiricahua did not carry maps drawn on paper. Their maps lived in story, in song, in the memory of where the water rose after a dry season and where a person could stand unseen for an entire day. A place like this pass was not learned once and forgotten. It was learned again and again, generation after generation, until the shape of the land and the shape of the people's memory became almost the same thing. Archaeologists working across this region have found the quiet evidence of that long presence. Rings of stone that once anchored brush shelters, grinding stones worn smooth by generations of hands. In the mountains nearby, rock overhangs still carry faded images left by people who lived here long before any wagon rolled west. Some of those markings are said to be more than 1,000 years old. This was never empty country. It only looked empty to those who did not know how to see it. When John Butterfield won a federal contract in 1858 to carry mail between Missouri and San Francisco, his stage line became the longest in the world. The full journey took roughly 25 days, with the only sleep coming inside the coach as it rattled over broken ground. To save time, the route was pushed straight through Doubtful Canyon. The men who ran that line understood the danger. No money, no jewelry, no valuables of any kind were permitted aboard the coaches passing through this stretch. Through the canyon itself, the stages often ran under the cover of darkness, without a single lantern lit, so that no light would betray them to the high ground above. Think about what that tells us. The travelers tried to cross this land unseen, moving blind through the dark, hoping the pass would not notice them. And yet, according to Chiricahua accounts passed down through later generations, the high points of these mountains had long been places from which the land below could be watched. Some traditions hold that certain ridges served as lookouts for so many years that the knowledge of them was carried from parent to child, a memory older than any stagecoach. The outsiders moved through in darkness, hoping not to be seen. The people of this country had been watching this ground, some accounts say, for longer than anyone could count. And there is something almost unsettling in that image when you hold the two halves together. A stagecoach creeping through the black of night, its passengers holding their breath, certain that silence and darkness would protect them, and above them, unseen, a country that had never once been dark to the people who knew it. To them, the pass at night was not a void. It was simply the pass, familiar as a room in one's own home, every stone in its place, every sound accounted for. The travellers believed they were passing through unnoticed. According to the traditions carried down through later generations, there was very little in these mountains that went unnoticed at all. For a time, the stages ran through with relatively few problems. Then the fragile peace broke. In the winter of 1861, a raid on a ranch and the kidnapping of a young boy set off a chain of events near a place called Apache Pass. A young army officer named George Bascom summoned the Chiricahua leader Cochise to a meeting and attempted to hold him and his family. Cochise, insisting he had no part in the raid, cut through the wall of a tent with a knife and escaped. What followed was a spiral of hostages taken and lives lost on both sides, a spiral that historians still discuss as one of the moments that opened more than 2 decades of conflict across the Southwest. It is worth pausing here. This is not a story of one people who were only cruel and another who were only innocent. It is a story of fear meeting fear, of misunderstanding hardening into grief, and of grief hardening into something that lasted for years. The land did not take sides, the people did. It would be easy, looking back across so many years, to sort these events into a simple shape, to decide who was right and who was wrong, who began it and who deserved what followed. But the closer you look at what actually happened in these mountains, the harder that sorting becomes. There were promises broken and promises kept on both sides. There was mercy and there was cruelty in nearly every direction. And underneath it all ran a deeper truth, which is that two peoples with two entirely different understandings of this land had been set on a collision that neither fully chose and neither could easily undo. The canyon watched all of it without judgment. That, perhaps, is the only honest way to tell this part of the story. By the spring of 1861, the Butterfield line was collapsing under the weight of a coming civil war, and yet a few determined men tried to keep the route through Doubtful Canyon alive. The Giddings brothers had been running passengers along this road since the late 1850s. They even advertised that an armed escort would travel through Indian country with each party. But crossing a country where armed escorts are thought necessary is rarely a comforting sign. In April of that year, a wagon heading west through the canyon simply vanished. Days later, another coach, this one carrying the stage superintendent himself, went into the pass and never came out the other side. 2 mules returned, badly bruised. A search party rode out and found scattered mail, pieces of harness, and the station at Steins Peak burned to the ground. Imagine that search for a moment. Men riding into the very pass that had already swallowed the people they were looking for, scanning the high ground on either side, knowing that whoever had done this might still be watching them do it. Every shadow between the rocks a possible threat. Every gust of wind through the stone a sound they could not quite name. They found pieces of the story scattered across the ground, but never the whole of it. Some of those who were lost in this pass were never found at all, and the country simply kept them, the way it seemed to keep so much else. What they found near the station was never forgotten by those who saw it. A newspaper account from the time described bodies bound and left in a way meant to be discovered, meant to be understood. This was not only violence, it was a message written into the land itself. And here the two ways of knowing this canyon seemed to meet. To the outsiders, the pass had become a place of horror, proof that Doubtful Canyon deserved its name. But the message left there was also a kind of communication, terrible and deliberate, in a country where those who lived here had always understood that this ground could speak, could carry meaning, could be made to say something to whoever came next. After the Giddings party was lost, the stagecoaches stopped coming. they turned south to a longer, safer road. And for a time, the only thing that kept Doubtful Canyon quiet was that almost no one dared to enter it at all. But the silence did not mean the land was empty. In the spring of 1864, a column of roughly 50 Union soldiers chose to cross the pass despite its reputation. As they moved through the low ground near Steins Peak, warriors attacked from the surrounding hills in a carefully planned ambush. For more than an hour, gunfire echoed between the stone walls. The men on the high ground held every advantage of position. The soldiers held an advantage in firepower. Eventually, the warriors withdrew back into the mountains, and both sides counted their losses. It became known as the skirmish at Doubtful Canyon, one of the larger clashes ever fought in this corner of the country. And what stands out, even now, is the precision of it. The soldiers never saw the ambush coming. The attackers seemed to know exactly where every man would be, exactly which paths a column would take, exactly where the ground itself would do half the work. To an outsider, this looked like luck. It was not luck. It was knowledge. A reading of terrain so complete that the mountains themselves became part of the plan. And this is worth sitting with, because it changes how we think about these events. The soldiers who crossed the pass were not careless men. They were experienced, well-armed, and fully aware of the canyon's terrible reputation. They took every precaution they knew how to take. And still, the ground itself seemed to be arranged against them, every ridge and hollow already understood by someone else. What the soldiers saw as a landscape, the people who lived here saw as something closer to a memory, held in common, passed down, as precise as any written record. Some accounts hold that the high points used in moments like these were the very same lookouts the Chiricahua had watched from for generations, places whose value was known long before any soldier ever entered the pass. Most historians believe the violence of these years involved some of the most powerful Apache leaders of the era, men whose names are still remembered and whose stories are still debated. The details of who was present and when remain subjects of ongoing discussion. But the larger truth is not in dispute. This was never a simple tale of raids. It had become a long cycle of loss and retaliation that neither side could easily stop, spreading across the whole of the Southwest. For decades, American control of this country existed more on maps than on the ground itself. And then the maps began to win. In 1880, the railroad reached the town of Wilcox, and the country around Doubtful Canyon changed forever. The stagecoaches were already gone. The old stations stood abandoned, their walls slowly returning to the earth, and for the first time, men with cameras came to record what was left. This is the moment our photographer Elias Ward stepped into. The war that had made this pass so feared was passing into memory. What remained was stone and wind and the accounts of those who had lived here long before. Records from this period describe survey parties and photographers documenting the ruined Butterfield stations across the region, including the remarkably preserved walls at Steins Peak. These images, made in the 1880s and the decades that followed, are among the first time this ground was ever fixed in a photograph. They show us the pass as it looked once the guns had fallen silent. High walls, a single narrow route, endless places to wait and watch and never be seen. There is a strange irony in those early photographs. The camera was a tool built to capture the visible, the measurable, the thing that could be proven to exist. And yet the men who carried it into this pass kept writing down things the camera could never hold. The way the light fell strange in the late afternoon, the way the wind seemed to carry a voice, the way a place could feel, to a person standing in it, as though it was somehow aware of being entered. These were not the notes of superstitious men. They were the notes of careful observers, trying and failing to record something that would not sit still inside a photograph. What the camera captured was stone. What it could not capture was everything the Chiricahua had always said the stone contained. Looking at that terrain through a camera, the outsiders finally understood what the Chiricahua had always known. This was never a random place. It was a perfect one. The high ground, the hidden approaches, the single path a wagon could take. Everything that had made it a place of death for travelers was the same thing that had made it a place of knowledge for those who lived here. And this is where the written record and the oral tradition stand side by side, each carrying half of the story. The photographs and the surveys tell us what the past looked like. The Chiricahua accounts, passed down through generations and treated here as the legitimate history they are, tell us what it meant. Some of these accounts speak of the land as something that holds memory, that certain places carry the weight of everything that has happened upon them. Some speak of ridges watched for so long that the watching became part of who the people were. For much of American history, records like these were dismissed. A written report was called evidence. A spoken memory was called a story, as though the two were not both simply ways of carrying the past forward through time. But anyone who studies these mountains honestly comes to the same quiet realization. The written record, for all its precision, is thin here. It tells us dates and names and the movements of soldiers. It tells us almost nothing about what this ground meant to the people who had known it longest. For that, we have only what was carried in memory. And memory, by its nature, does not survive the way a photograph does. It depends on someone still being there to remember, and on someone still being there to listen. When those chains are broken, the knowledge does not become false. It simply becomes lost, slipping out of the world as quietly as wind leaving a canyon. None of this can be proven in the way a photograph proves a wall still stands. It is memory, not measurement. But memory is a form of history too, and we may never know how much of what the land was said to hold has simply been lost to us, unrecorded, unphotographed, carried away with the last people who knew how to listen. Which brings us back to Elias Ward, standing at the mouth of the canyon in 1883, writing down a sound he could not explain. What if the wind he heard was only wind, and what if it was not? What if some places really do keep something of everyone who passes through them? What if the difference between a haunted canyon and an ordinary one is only whether you were taught how to listen? We cannot answer these questions. That may be the point of them. History, in the end, is an incomplete puzzle. We are handed the pieces that survived, the photographs, the newspaper accounts, the walls that refused to fall, and we are missing all the pieces that were never written down, the ones carried only in memory, in story, in the sound of wind through stone. We reach for a whole picture and find only fragments, and we are left to wonder what the empty spaces once held. Doubtful Canyon is quiet now. Most people who cross this part of the Southwest never know it is there. They pass by at speed on the interstate, shielded by glass, unaware that just beyond the road lies one of the most feared stretches of trail in the history of the American frontier. The stagecoaches are gone. The conflict is long over. The travelers who feared this canyon vanished generations ago, and so did the people who called it home. But the pass remains, the high walls remain, and on certain evenings when the wind moves through the rocks the way it moved for Elias Ward, it is easy to understand why some people once believed this land was listening. Thank you so much for watching. If stories like this one, where the written record and the memory of a people meet in a single piece of ground, are the kind of history you want to sit with, consider subscribing and stay with us as we keep searching these forgotten places. And let me leave you with one question. If you stood alone in Doubtful Canyon at dusk and the wind rose through the stones around you, do you think the land would remember that you were there? I'll see you in the next documentary.